Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Sheila Coronel. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at the Columbia Journalism School. We're very pleased to have tonight Kathleen Carroll and Joel Simon for this conversation on the new censorship. Journalism is an increasingly dangerous profession. No one knows this more than our guests tonight. Joel Simon is director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, an organization founded in 1981 by a group of US correspondents who realized they couldn't ignore the dangers their colleagues around the world were facing. CPJ's research and advocacy are focused on defending the rights of journalists to report the news without fear of reprisal. Wherever in the world journalists are attacked, imprisoned, killed, kidnapped, threatened, censored, or harassed, CPJ takes action. When journalists can't speak for themselves, CPJ speaks up on their behalf. I know this because before coming to New York, I wasn't a journalist in the Philippines. And CPJ was the group we would run to whenever we were in trouble. CPJ has played a key role in raising awareness about impunity in the killings of journalists in my country and elsewhere around the world. Joel is uniquely positioned to talk about how the landscape of threats has changed in the past few years. His new book, copies are available on the table at the back of the room. It's called The New Censorship. It was published by the Columbia Journalism Review with the Columbia University Press. It documents the changes that have taken place in the global media landscape. It's must-reading for those of you who want to work as journalists overseas, or for those of you who want to learn more about how, despite technological changes in the information revolution, journalism is an even more endangered profession. The Columbia Journalism School is proud to be hosting this event tonight. Our school has a long tradition of press freedom work. Many of us teach and do research on press freedom worldwide. Several of our faculty, including myself and Victor Navasky, who just walked in, sit on CPJ's board of trustees. More importantly, 40% of our students come from overseas, many of them from the places that Joel talks about in his book. Joel will be joined tonight by Kathleen Carroll, who is also a member of the CPJ board. As the executive editor and senior vice president of the Associated Press, Kathleen is the top news executive of the world's largest independent news agency. She oversees some 2,300 journalists working in more than 100 countries. So she has a very keen awareness of the problems we will be talking about tonight. Please join me in welcoming Joel Simon and Kathleen Carroll.
Thank you, Sheila. Joel, why don't you start out by talking a little bit about this fabulous new book?
Well, I'd love to, Kathleen. Thank you so much, and thank you, Sheila. Thank you to the Journalism School for hosting this discussion. So the new censorship explores fundamental contradictions of our modern global existence. Why, in an age defined by information, are the people who bring us the news dying in record numbers? Why, at a time when technology was supposed to make censorship impossible, is it actually on the rise? So let's start off with some raw numbers. According to CPJ data, these last 2 years have been the most deadly and dangerous for journalists in history. A record number of journalists have been killed, a record number are in prison, freedom of expression is on the wane, according to indices compiled by independent advocacy groups. So in the new censorship, what I try to do is address these issues not in abstract theoretical terms, but based on my own experience as executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. So the book opens with a CPJ mission that we undertook to Pakistan. And this mission happened to coincide with the May 2nd, 2011 raid that killed Osama bin Laden. So being on the scene in Pakistan gave me a renewed appreciation for the unique role that local journalists play in informing their own societies, but also the global public, particularly in times of crisis. And it also clarified for me personally the imperative that I feel to support the efforts of local journalists on the front lines who bring us the news. So I began my own career as a journalist covering Mexico and Central America, and I'm actually old enough to recall writing my very first story on a manual typewriter and filing by dictation. So I made my living as a freelancer, often selling the exact same story to multiple publications. Now, this is a kind of journalism, like so many others, that has been completely disrupted by the internet. So in the first chapter, I describe the transition as I've seen it. When I was in Mexico, there were a few dozen international reporters, and we sort of served as information gatekeepers interpreting Mexico for the world. And, you know, we did a decent job, but most of us were working on more or less the same story for different markets and audiences. And just to sort of fast forward, by the time the 2003 Iraq War rolled around, this kind of reporting was obsolete. Since news consumers, people who were following developments, could easily curate their own news by using search. And then if you want to fast forward again to the 2010 Arab uprisings, active curation had been replaced by social media, which not only democratized news gathering, in some ways it made it more efficient and more participatory. Journalism has not been transformed by these technologies. Frankly, it's been upended. So there's obviously tremendous excitement about what's happening in many ways, particularly at a place like Columbia, but there are tremendous challenges as well, and I want to focus on some of those because in some ways the abundance of information that's available online obscures the tremendous gaps in our knowledge about global events because information is suppressed by violence and censorship. One of the leading obstacles to the free flow of information is the rise of what I call the democratators. And these are elected autocrats who, empowered by popular support and their success at the polls, use their power to dismantle the institutions that constrain them, particularly the media. So in the book, I look at a couple of case studies. I look at Erdogan in Turkey. I look at the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I look at Vladimir Putin in Russia. And these are all leaders who have used these strategies to mask their repressive policies towards the media, and they've used things like punitive tax audits and legal harassment and anti-terror prosecutions and the creation of parallel media structures financed and supported by the state. And these strategies are effective because the leaders are able to position these actions as consistent with international norms. And this, in my view, is the very essence of the new censorship. Journalists also face a variety of threats from non-state actors, including criminal and terror groups. And in fact, if you look at the terror dynamic as it played out in Iraq, this meant that journalists felt threatened by both militant groups that sought to kidnap and kill them, and the US military, whose overly aggressive tactics led to the deaths of 16 journalists during that conflict, and the unjustified detention of many reporters held for long periods in deplorable conditions. As Kathleen knows well, one of those journalists was an AP reporter. And I address in the book specific actions that the media and journalists can take in response to the kidnapping epidemic, and perhaps we can discuss that during the question and answer period. I also look at the threat to the internet itself. The internet is a shared global resource and the primary platform for independent journalism, particularly across borders. The reality is that the structures that underpin the internet and allow it to function as it does today are threatened by autocratic governments, notably China, which seeks to build not only a system of domestic control, but to reform internet governance so that the internet itself better serves state interests. So, in order to combat these emerging threats to media freedom, I argue for specific concrete action. That means confronting the deplorable record of impunity in the killing of journalists, which today is around 90%. I profile two murdered journalists, Anna Politkovskaya in Russia and Marlene Garcia Esperat in the Philippines, who were both victims of state violence. And I explain how international advocacy in both of their cases led to partial justice. And I highlight the promise and the limitations of such a strategy.